So good morning to those who have joined to date. This is the inaugural webinar in what we hope will be a series of we're calling professional development webinars aimed at supporting the Isle of Man's health and care transformation programme. I'm just setting the scene this morning. My name's James Kingsland. For those who don't know me, I've recently been appointed as the independent clinical and professional advisor within the programme and chair the transformation panel. I'm pleased to see some colleagues from the panel joining the meeting. Part of my remit is to help inform the programme as it is implemented and bring in or source information evidence to support the programme from experts from across the globe, certainly from across the Irish Sea, but more widely. We are looking at speakers from as far as the US, Canada, Australia, and in India for future presentations if we're successful in these meetings. Just the bit of housekeeping is that following the presentation or during the presentation, if you can use the conversation or the chat function to pose any questions to our esteemed guests, or towards the end, hopefully we'll have enough time for some Q&A. The meeting will be recorded as well, and we're just working out where best to place that, but hopefully that will be on the Health and Care Transformation website. But first, to introduce our guests and set the scene, I'm delighted that Sir Jonathan Michael is joining us from sunnier climes. Often, with introducing guests, you say they need no introduction. I think no more so than Sir Jonathan, who, of course, was the author of the independent review for the Isle of Man's health and care system. So I'll hand over to Jonathan. But we've got another Knight of the Realm. I think Knights of the Realm are a little bit like buses. You wait all day for one to come along, then two arrive at once. But to our first Knight of the Realm, Jonathan, over to you to introduce our guests and set the scene.
Thank you, James, and good morning to everybody. As you all know, the Isle of Man has embarked on a comprehensive transformation of the health and care, social care system. And the aim is to deliver high quality, clinically and financially viable, fully integrated health and care service for the population of the island. Such programs take time and obviously involve cultural as well as organizational procedural change. And the transformation program has now been running for just over a year. And despite the challenges of COVID, the transformation program is making good progress. In delivering such major changes, it's important to be able to place the present and planned or future services for the island in the context of what others are doing around other health and care systems, exploring and adopting where appropriate evidence-based best practice, but in a manner which actually fits the requirements of the island, particularly as a small island economy. Listening and learning from others is an essential part of transformation, and thus I'm delighted that James has established this series of developmental seminars. I'm also delighted that the first seminar is on the important subject of value-based healthcare. I'm very pleased to welcome Sir Muir Greer, a former colleague of mine from Oxford, who, after a long and distinguished career as a public health physician in the NHS and wider afield, Muir established the Oxford Centre for Triple Value Healthcare, of which he is the founding director. Muir is joined today by Dr. Tim Wilson, who is managing director of the Oxford Centre. Tim's specific expertise and interest is in clinical change programs designed to increase value. Tim's worked at the Department of Health Care Policy and IHI at Harvard, and then as a policy advisor to the UK Department of Health and indeed to Number 10, before he went on to lead the healthcare advisory practice at PwC before joining Muir in the Oxford Centre. I welcome you both, and without further ado, hand over to my fellow knight. Muir, over to you.
Well, we often look at the Isle of Man with a degree of envy. And I'm going to tell you what our struggle is in England and what we're trying to do in England. And this is I think, Jonathan, my 28th reorganisation of the structure of the NHS in England, most of which have made no difference at all. And we're going to take a new paradigm and describe the new approach. And the first picture of the entrance to Reading Car Park, Tim, if you put it up, please. The first is an image of what modern healthcare is like. As you can see, this is a well-built car park. And imagine you're in charge of car parking in Reading, and there are complaints that 20 people cannot get in to join the people who are parked. Now, it's all very well managed. The height is clear, that's like cost effectiveness. The speed, that's like quality. Safety, pedestrians can't go, and the police inspect it from time to time. But the 20 people who are outside, what about them? Should we try and increase efficiency? Should we try and squeeze the cars closer together? Unfortunately, the doors won't open, so we can't. There reaches a point where we can't do that. We need to think of different ways of tackling this problem, particularly because some of the people who can't get in are in greater need and would have greater benefit than some of the ones who are in. Next, please, Tim. Now, this has been highlighted for us in COVID. The problems we're talking about existed long before COVID, and they will exist after COVID unless we take action. And the action that's required is a new approach called the culture of stewardship. And it's essential for the maintenance of universal healthcare. And as you can see here, the limitations of space were brought up. It wasn't just money that was the problem. It was the limitations of space, operating theatre space, intensive care space, even the amount of equipment and personal protective equipment. So it's not just money that is the problem. In fact, as the COVID people demonstrated, there were clearly other issues to do with resources. Now, if we look at the future, Tim, please, next, we can see that inexorably need and demand will go up faster than resources. And we see this in every country in the world. And even a small increase in resources will not be sufficient to match the increase in need and demand. And if we think it's appropriate to be careful about how we use the word resources, because it's not just money. Next, please, Tim. So here are the resources to think about. There's obviously money, but as we've seen, interestingly, in recent months, money is not really a problem. The amount of money that's been invested by the Treasury is surpassed what any of us have seen, not just in healthcare, but just the way in which money is highly flexible. More important resources are time and carbon. And I'll mention carbon, and I don't know if you discuss this much in the Isle of Man, but we find that the carbon footprint of a hospital or health centre often motivates clinicians more than discussions about money. The concern about the carbon use, and 80% of carbon use is determined by clinicians. About 20% is staff and patient travel, and 60% is the carbon in the manufacture and distribution of drugs and equipment. Only 20% is heating and lighting and air conditioning. But the key issue is time. The time of clinicians, the time of leaders, and increasingly, the time of the people we call patients. And Jonathan and I know very well from Oxford that time of patients is becoming an increasingly important and public issue. Trying to get car parked on the site of the Oxford Hospital, we tell people to allow an hour to find a parking space. That's after it's taken them 2 hours to drive the 10 miles from Whitney to the John Radcliffe for a 9 o'clock appointment. So, money, time, and carbon. These are finite, particularly time. And we'll come on to look at time from different perspectives. Next. Now let's just think a little bit about the growth of need and demand. I'm very interested in population aging, and population aging is usually blamed as the cause of increasing need and demand, but it's not. And this graph shows clearly the different types of driver of need and demand. And what we are particularly interested in is, and next please, Tim, is what we call the relentless increase in need and demand. And this is the title of an article first written in 1993 by David Eddy, The Relentless Increase in the Volume and Intensity of Clinical Practice. So here are some examples of the relentless increase. Now these are England. We haven't looked for data from the Isle of Man, but we see it in other countries in which we're working. So here's an example of one of the drivers of need and demand. And as you can see, this expenditure on a particular type of treatment just went up inexorably. Next, please. Here's another very interesting figure from a study done by a team in the Oxford Department of Primary Health Care. And it shows that the increase in testing, mostly laboratory testing, went up 3.5-fold between 2000 and 2015. Now, let's just think a little bit about the implications of this and the value of this. So in terms of value, much of this has been driven by clinicians just making a response to a challenge they face. The laboratories have also played their part by increasing the number of tests on a single blood sample. But the impact has been that the average GP in England now spends 70 minutes more every day looking at lab results. This amounts to 4,924 GPs. And Mr. Hunt promised 5,000 extra GPs. Well, all of them could be looking at computer screens the whole time. But what has been the value to patients of this increase in testing? That is not clear, but almost certainly a lot of this is without value or has negative value because it gives false positive test results. And we've estimated that there are probably several million additional referrals to hospital resulting from this increase in testing without any benefit. Next, please, Tim. Now, the hip replacement was undoubtedly a wonderful development. It was voted operation of the century by the Lancet for the last century. So here's what's happening. And you can see it's a very similar shape of curve as the curve for laboratory testing. It is increasing steadily all the time. And of course, much of this is of high value. But surprisingly, studies of quality of life after hip replacement reveal that a significant proportion of people, maybe even a quarter, report worse quality of life after hip replacement, even though the hip replacement was done by highly trained teams working to high levels of quality. It's not to do with problems of the operation. It's not to do with technical quality. It's something to do with the intervention being done to people without identifying what was really the problem that was bothering them most, and therefore what is the outcome that will be of greatest benefit to them. Next, please, Tim. Here we have another very interesting graph of the increase in coronary artery bypass grafting. And I've got a stent, which I'm very grateful for as a consequence of a myocardial infarction, and the stent was inserted within about 5 hours of the pain starting. But of course, many of these stents and much of the coronary artery bypass grafting is elective. And the elective operation has been shown to be of value to a lower proportion of people. But again, we've seen this rise, the relentless rise in the volume and intensity of clinical practice. People are getting this intervention in addition to medical therapy and other types of therapy. Next, please, Tim. So, here's a pretty picture. There's the anticoagulants in the top left, and you can see there the rise in spending from open prescribing. That's our data source based in Oxford. The lab testing, the percutaneous coronary interventions, and the hip replacements. The four we've seen in every country. And they say we don't have data for the Isle of Man, but it'd be interested in your views. The relentless increase in volume and intensity. Now, let's look at some of the consequences. Next, please, Tim. And here are two of the consequences. On the left-hand side, you can see the smoking cessation intervention rate. And it's almost a mirror image of the previous ones that we've shown. On the right-hand side, we can see what's happened to education as opposed to health. And most people would believe and hold the belief that education, and this is, of course, now a particularly important issue, and education of people in the subgroups of the population most affected by deprivation is of vital importance, short-term and long-term. Interestingly, when we meet with colleagues from local government and the health service, people complain about pressures on the budget. The local government colleagues are completely unimpressed because they've had to put up with real cuts over the last decade. So that's what has happened and what will continue to happen unless we do something. Next, please, Tim. Now, what should we do? Well, what we've inherited is what we call 2D healthcare. And I say we're in my 28th reorganization of 2D healthcare. And the two dimensions, one are the types of care, primary, secondary, tertiary, generalist, specialist, super specialist. The names differ from place to place, but pretty stable, really. And then on the other dimension is the structure. And living in Oxfordshire, I've seen district health authorities, area health authorities, CCGs, ICSs. Things change very frequently. But healthcare is too complex for a bureaucratic solution. And these are two different types of bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracies are very important for linear tasks, like the fair and open employment of staff, or the uncorrupt management of money. But as I said, healthcare is much more complex. Next, please, Tim. So healthcare trends like this trend here cannot be managed simply by making the reorganization of the bureaucracy, by increasing guidance, by increasing regulation, by increasing inspection. That is not going to solve this problem. We need to tackle the two other issues in a health service, systems and culture, and Tim will be discussing this. Next, please, Tim. So, we're trying to hit the button of a paradigm shift, and in England, that's quite a difficult thing to do. You're tapping on the key, but the screen doesn't change that much. But let me just describe the paradigm shifts that have taken place. Next, please, Tim. Now, the thing about a paradigm shift is that it doesn't displace the previous paradigms. Einstein's paradigm shift did not displace Newtonian physics. It embraced it and enfolded it, and it still has a part to play. So when I look back over what Jonathan and I have experienced, we can see four big shifts that have taken place. Firstly, there was the concern about effectiveness. epitomised by Archie Cochrane's wonderful book, which led to the Cochrane collaboration. It wasn't just what the doctor said would work, there had to be evidence of effectiveness. And this led to the second paradigm shift, the evidence-based decision-making. And we recruited Dave Sackett in Oxford about 21 years ago, and to develop the concept of evidence-based decision-making, which is now standard, of course. Then as things got tougher, we moved on to cost effectiveness. So it wasn't just sufficient to know about the effectiveness, we had to think about cost effectiveness and starting to think about the alternative use of the way that money was being spent. Then, starting about 2000, quality and safety of the institutions providing care for the patients who actually managed to make it through the door. But it's important here to remember that there's a marked effect of deprivation. And Jonathan, you'll be interested to know that they developed a new cardiology service in Oxford, and they received more referrals from North Oxford, the prosperous part, than they did from Blackbird Leys, which is the poorest part of the city. So quality and safety are very important for the patients who arrive, but we now need to move on to the new paradigm, which embraces all of these, which remain absolutely necessary, but the value paradigm. Next, please, Tim. Now, let me finish with a little bit of art. So this is this is two-dimensional art. This is art before the Renaissance. And then along came, next please, Tim, a third dimension. This is the Battle of San Romano. It's in Firenze in Italy. And it was painted by, next please, Tim, Uccello. So what we're going to talk about now is a completely new way of looking at the health of population and how we deliver services. The third dimension is looking at populations. But to see it, you have to look through a new set of lenses, and that's the cultural change. And I'm passing over to Tim now to speak about the work we've been doing on the culture of stewardship. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Mira. That's terrific. So in essence, what we're postulating here is not yet another structural reorganization, not another set of processes, not a new way of regulating, not a new way of commissioning. Indeed, the jury out is out on all of those elements. But actually, like, as Mira said, like the previous paradigm shifts, evidence-based medicine, quality and safety, a new way of thinking. So just as Uccello changed us from thinking about two-dimensional art, which existed all the way through to the 14th century, if you think of the Bayeux tapestry, 2 dimensions again, think about all that, and then suddenly along came Uccello and we looked at things differently. And this is what we're asking you to do, look at things differently, think of things differently. So I'm going to take you into this concept of stewardship, and in the Isle of Man, if I've got my numbers right, there's 178 million spent in the NHS. I mean, someone can correct me, but please bear with me for the moment. And we want you to start to imagine what it is if you were all to become stewards of that 178 million. Or indeed, as Mira said, the time that you have, each in every one of you have, the patients have, the clinicians have, the leaders have, and so forth, or the carbon that you emit in the production of healthcare. So we want to think about how you become stewards. I don't know how many of you this will resonate for many of you, but here's the fishing zones to the Isle of Man. And what's happened is because some of those fishing zones could easily become depleted and unsustainable, they've set up marine nature reserves shown in the dark blue, and then obviously the light blue are the areas where you can still fish. So they've realized that the resources that are the fishing zones around the Isle of Man just as you have resources for healthcare, need to be protected, and there needs to be some collective action to work out how to use those resources. Back in 1833, this gentleman here, William Foster Lloyd, he wrote a very important economic pamphlet, and he talked about shepherds. So, but this could apply to fishermen or farmers requiring water and so on. And he explained this situation where if a shepherd put more than his allotted number of sheep onto common grazing land, or a fisherman was to take more fish, where even though that shepherd would get some additional benefits in the short term, in the long term, the commons would be depleted and the land would be overgrazed or overfished, or the water would be used up. And this was later picked up by someone called Garrett Hardin and was written in a very important paper in Science in the 1960s, and it was named The Tragedy of the Commons. Now, all the big efforts that we make in improving healthcare are all chiefly around creating structures, creating new bodies, new new organizations, new things, and so forth. And yet, of course, especially I guess in a place like the Isle of Man, these structures in some ways, I'm sure, are important, but the relationships you have with each other, because you must all know each other, all the clinicians, all the managers, all the administrators, all the all the other folks, the leaders, you must know each other to wave in the street and say hello. And yet, unfortunately, in England certainly, I don't know about where you are on the Isle of Man. We have read Jonathan's excellent report. So much effort in England goes on structural reorganisation, and I was just joking with Jonathan that in Oxford there's yet another structural reorganisation going on of the commissioners in Oxford, and yet very little effort is played on culture. Actually, there is sometimes people look at culture, and that's when things go wrong. So if you look at the English long-term plan, culture is mentioned 7 times. If you look at the France's report into the failures of Mid Staffordshire, culture mentioned something like 170 times. So we think about culture when things go wrong, but we forget about it when we're trying to get things right. And yet everything we know from studies, from business books and so on is culture. It is the most important factor. And that's what we want you to think about. We want you to adopt a new culture, a new way of thinking. We're not worried about what structures you have or process. We want to get you to think differently. And the reason we want to do this is because of this Nobel Prize-winning economist, Elinor Ostrom. And Elinor Ostrom's careful work, she basically went around the world. She wasn't actually looking for tragedy of the commons, or it turned out that's what she was doing. And she never found the tragedy of the commons. She found that a group of people who were using resources, a group of fishermen or women, farmers, shepherds, if they looked after the resources themselves, they actually developed sophisticated mechanisms for decision making and rule enforcement. Whereas she found if it was central authorities or external people who decided how resources were used, supplies, things often became unsustainable. So this very important Nobel Prize winning work suggests that those using the resources, in other words, clinicians and patients, as Muir described earlier, they're the people who really ought to be given the responsibility for managing the use of resources. Now, in order to do this, and I'm going to sort of canter through this so we can stop for questions, we've identified there are 5 tasks that need to lead to sustainable health and care. As Muir said, what we want you to do is to start to do things differently. It's this new paradigm of 3 dimensions. So just like a cello went from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, we're going to go from 2 dimensions in healthcare, from those bureaucracies, very important bureaucracies, we're not against them, but to this 3rd dimension. I'm going to take you through thinking in 3D, designing in 3D, working in 3D, and finally leading in 3D. So there's 2D healthcare. Muir's described it. This is the NHS in England in 2019, and we could draw similar ones Next year, it'll have different letters at the bottom, and we could draw different similar ones for 10 years ago, and it'll have different letters at the bottom again. But broadly, it always stays much the same. What we need instead is the third dimension, the other enduring thing. So Muir's already explained how on the y-axis, the types of care, private providers, community care, general practice, mental health, hospitals, specialist hospitals, so on and so forth, are quite enduring. So are populations. So you will have people with type 1 diabetes. You will have had them 10 years ago. You'll have had them with 20 years ago. You'll have people with type 2 diabetes today, 10 years ago, 20 years. You'll have people with asthma. You'll have people with who are frail. You'll have people who are at the end of life. You'll have people who have organ failure. There are population segments that are enduring and will always be there, regardless of what happens on the axis at the bottom there, the x-axis. This new third dimension, this new axis, is the population segments, as we call them. The approach that England's taking to working out segmentation is one called Bridges to Health. We have to warn you, there is no perfect mechanism for segmenting populations, and indeed it will create enormous heated arguments. And I suspect some of you are already looking at this picture and thinking, oh, that's not right, or whatever. What we can tell you is, not just in our opinion, but the opinion of those who've systematically researched different types of segmentation approaches, feel that the Bridges to Health approach gives the best compromise. It's perhaps the least worst solution, but it is the best one. And if you start to think about it, you will have pathways for cancer, you'll have pathways for diabetes, you'll have pathways for COPD, you'll have end-of-life programs and so on. And you'll start to recognize in these population segments ways in which you naturally already organize yourself. So the first step is to think in 3 dimensions and then start to organize in 3 dimensions. And the way we are doing this in England and in other health systems is by getting them to segment their population. And the approach we're encouraging them to use, as it's being rolled by NHS England, is the Bridges to Health approach. The second thing is, once you've got those segments, you've got to work out, well, what we're going to do with them. And just remember, actually, that each population segment is not just the people you're seeing. It's not just the patients. It's everybody with a need. So immediately, as soon as you think in segments, you're thinking about a broader group. Now, what you then need is a system to look after that population segment. And the definition that Muir sort of coined is that a system is a set of connected activities with a shared aim. A set of connected activities with a shared aim. So if you think of an orchestra, you've got a whole set of different activities, some where they're playing violins, some cellos, some blowing into brass instruments, some banging timpani, and so on and so forth. There's a whole set of activities. And they don't just have a leader in front of them, because they could have a leader, but if they're all playing different pieces of music, it'll be a cacophony. They have a shared aim. They're all playing Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. Now, instead of the orchestra, we obviously have a different set of things at systems. So you'll have a specialist clinic. You have cardiologists in the Isle of Man. You have diabetes specialists, respiratory specialists. You have general practices, inpatient beds. You have pharmacists prescribing. You obviously the individual. There are all sorts of different parts of a system for each population segment, whether it's end of life, diabetes, or whatever. So there's all these different connected activities. And we would also include in those connected activities, by the way, pathways, because pathways are often one part of a system for a population segment. You know, and they're an important factor, but they're not often don't describe a whole system. So each system, here's all the connected activities. And we therefore need to create an aim. What is it that those connected activities are going to do together? What are the outcomes that they're going to be trying to achieve? If you turn those outcomes into objectives, what then are the criteria that may be to measure whether you're achieving those outcomes? You might have a few structural measures if you think that's very important. And then, of course, for that group, you've got to work out how much are we allocating to this group? How much are we spending? And this enables us to start to answer questions like, is asthma care on the Isle of Man as good as in Birkenhead or in Birmingham or in Oxford or wherever? Because if we actually have an aim and the set of outcomes that you're measuring, and you know how much you're spending on asthma care in the Isle of Man, you know if you're doing roughly the same, if you're doing as well as they do in my patch here in Oxford or elsewhere in the world. Now, each system and with an aim needs to be built on a set of values. And one of the important things in Jonathan's report, which is the reaffirmation of the 7 principles that the Tynwald also then passed in 2018 of the NHS in the Isle of Man. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but any system you have, the aim and the outcomes should reflect these 7 principles. And the point is, as Muir said, these principles firmly endorse the idea of equity. So are you treating people with most need first, or is it the people who are the loudest you're treating? Are you, if you look at number 6, the principles, are you making best value of the taxpayers' money on the Isle of Man? And so on and so forth. The quality movement means we're covering principle 3 well. And some of the work that's done around patient experience means we're managing principle 4 well. But actually, when you start to look at the other principles, we're often lacking in health services. Now, on the Isle of Man, you've got a hospital, you've got the Noble Hospital, you've got general practices, you've got social care, you've got various other different bureaucracies. We talked about these. But what we're saying is you need to create some sort of grouping. We happen to call them population stewardship forums. Don't worry about the name of that. But what we're saying is that you need to create a network of people that actually are interested in that population of people with diabetes, that population of people at the end of life, that population of people who are frail. And you need to create these networks across organizational boundaries. And these networks largely can be driven by relationships, but they will be delivering the aim and the outcomes with the resources we've allocated, as we've explained. And indeed, this is this group of shepherds or fishermen or farmers that Eleanor Ostrom described. This network is going to have a culture of stewardship. Their job is to use the resources allocated to them most wisely for the population they're caring for, just as the shepherds do, just as the fishermen do, just as the farmers do. And it's not about doing one thing, it's about doing things continuously. So just as we had the movement of continuous quality improvement, we need to have a movement of continuous value improvement. These networks need to be restless and constantly improving and changing. And they make decisions like, with respiratory, if we're spending X amount on respiratory, how much should we spend on sleep apnea, COPD, or asthma? They make decisions about, where the money should go, where is the greatest need. Within COPD, they make decisions about, should we be spending as much on triple drug therapy or less, and should we be spending more on rehabilitation? Should we be spending less on triple drug therapy and more on stopping smoking programs? So they start to be responsible for using those resources most wisely. Which population subsegment should we be spending it on, or which therapies within that subsegment should we be spending on? I've already mentioned about the importance of focusing culture, and really, we often remind you that John Cotter said that, the job of managers, the job of leaders is to create culture, and the job of managers is to sort of administer within that culture, to work within that culture. So all of you as leaders need to be thinking about what culture are you creating? This is the number one job you have. What we found, based on the work of people like Edgar Schein, Eleanor Ostrom, and others, is there are 4 things that leaders can do. One is to reinforce and push and constantly remind people of values. Wouldn't it be great if someone, when they arrived in the Isle of Man to come and work in the NHS, they were given a little book and they said, these are the values we all ascribe to. This is what we really work to. And then that same person goes to the coffee break and someone says, oh, have you had the values book? What do you think of it? And then 2 weeks later, they see a decision be made in the meeting and the chair of the meeting says, hang on, let's look back at our values group book. So you can imagine this values book starts to drive everything you do. Of course, those values mean that you are going to have a set of behaviours that you agree to. What are the behaviours you do think are right? What are the behaviours about the use of resources? Are you going to fight over resources, or are you going to work out the best way of you using resources for your population? That's certainly one of the principles you've signed up to, or the Tin World has signed you up to. So what are the behaviours that look like around that? Then language is so important. Language filters through everything, and Muir and I often can be quite pedantic. We'll catch people out of language, we'll not catch them out, but we'll correct them, we'll check on them and so on, challenge them, because people often use phrases interchangeably. For instance, I'm pretty sure if we were to send out a questionnaire asking you to define the word equity or equality or productivity or efficiency, you'd all come up with different meanings. And yet these are phrases and words we use all the time during meetings, and yet you have different meanings. And the point is that language is not just a way of describing reality, it actually shapes reality. When you use language, when you speak, the words you use shape your brain, they rewire your brain. And this is what the neurophysicists are now telling us. So the language you use, if it's aggressive, angry language, will be rewiring your brain to be so you become aggressive and angry. So the language a leader sets, creates is very important. And then finally, artifacts. What are the artifacts that you want in a system? If we were to come in 2 or 3 years to the Isle of Man, what would be the things that Muir and I would see that would tell us that you've got value-based healthcare in place? Would you have a report on end-of-life care for the people who died in the last year and the value of that end-of-life care? Is that report, has that report been in a local television station? Has it been in the local newspaper? That's a pretty powerful artifact, because it certainly holds you accountable, which, if you recall, is Principle 7 in the principles the Tin World endorsed. Finally, just a sort of quick thing. We focused very much in those first 4 tasks on population value. So all those things we've talked about will increase population value. Defining population segments, creating a value framework, an outcomes framework for each population segment, establishing networks to adopt a culture of stewardship and continuous value improvement for that population, and then leaders changing the culture to think about stewardship. So everything is focusing around stewardship and the 7 principles of the Constitution. But the other side of population value is personal value. And the important thing around personal value is actually it's almost never in conflict with population value. People get very worried about this, but most of the time, if you follow evidence-based practice, if you follow people's own shared decision making, you'll actually increase population value and personal value. And the project we've just completed on end of life in Essex has demonstrated that, and the project we're doing on musculoskeletal in the Midlands is also showing exactly the same. The two are entirely compatible. Personalising care is really about decision making, whether it's decision making of the individual in the morning or during the day, or the decision making when they go in to see a clinician to make a fateful decision. And there are 3 factors that need to be taken into consideration. What is it that matters to that individual? What is the evidence in the literature that individual needs to know about? And how does that evidence apply to them? And that's the way to personalise care. At fateful decisions, this can be shared decision making, or during the process of care, this can be all sorts of self-care support. And indeed, there was a paper published in the BMJ this last week reinforcing the benefits of self-care for asthma. And then, as Muir said, we shouldn't just think about side effects and so forth. We've got to think about what we're doing to the patient, the travel time. If you're in a 0 hours contract, taking time off to go to a doctor's appointment, which takes a long time, probably means loss of income, which you can ill afford to lose. So we need to understand the treatments, what it does to people, and we need to think about how the impact that's having and the investment that people are making for care. So we'll finish now, and I'm obviously happy to take questions. So as Mura said, healthcare is facing this new challenge. There are only finite resources, and we have to make best use of the resources. We're not asking for a major structural change. We're asking you to think differently. And in particular, we're asking you to embrace these 5 tasks: work in population segments or think in populations and 3D, create a value framework or design for 3D, increase value through networks, that is work in 3D, create and establish a culture of stewardship, that's lead in 3D, and then optimize personal value. So hopefully that's been helpful, and thank you very much, everybody.
Tim and Muir, thank you, and I'm most grateful for helping launch this development seminar program, and no better place to start, I think, than value-based healthcare when looking to reform a whole system. 2 major take-home messages, and often I say, if we're starting any reform program, where do you start? And starting with the data, and we're showing how important the data or the information to not just look at activity and processes, but the productivity and deployment of resources. And that's not just, as Mia was saying, money, and using that to measure quality and outcomes in relation to investments. And I'm going to come to a question just about how you can mandate that, because of course, setting up the new organisation called Manx Care, there is going to be the mandate between DHSC and Manx Care. But then secondly, of course, the cultural shift that's required, which is so difficult. The art of control by letting go, because sometimes as the centre designs a reform programme, to allow then the teams at the front line to have the freedom to create the delivery mechanisms, rather than leaving it as a centralism approach. So thank you again. I was just looking on our conversation site where there isn't, but if anyone has questions, we have a short amount of time. So we did promise a hard finish at 9 o'clock when people will be leaving anyway. So if there are questions, could you just use the raise your hand button, and I'll bring you in. I'll just check on that. But possibly then returning to this challenge, which of course, like any health and care system reform, part of the programme is to link to the quadruple aim of reform, to drive down the per capita costs of care whilst improving quality. How is there any way that can be mandated? Is there anything from the mandate that was created for the reformed NHS in England? Because one of the things that is going to be created as Manx Care goes live in shadow form from the 1st of April, part of it then will be DHSC's. I think colleagues from DHSC are on the call as well. Impossible to mandate cultural change, but mandating the process of value-based healthcare. Any thoughts or advice on that particular area? And I've just got, I think, also from our participants, Dr. If I may just collect some questions, Dr. Pam, who is the vice chair of the transformation panel as well, a consultant from Nobles. Ishaku, can I bring you in as well to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much for this excellent inaugural seminar on value-based healthcare. I think it is thoroughly apt as a new paradigm, and cultural change absolutely is the apex of what needs to happen in I think practically all the organizations that deliver healthcare. My question really is that, and I suspect it's not something that can be answered within a few minutes, is how to bring about cultural change. I think it's a huge area, and I would hope that subsequent seminars like this will address that possibility. As James has always said, integrated care is about integrating behaviors. And I think at the heart of cultural change is behavior. So how do you achieve that, or can you point us in the direction of where such resources exist? Thank you.
So, shall I pick up both aspects? So, James, you said about how do we mandate this, and then Ishaka, you asked about the culture change. So, the culture change in the end is a leadership job. It's not one leader. You probably on this call, you are all leaders in some form or the other. And it is something you have to just keep driving over time. You have to agree your values and reinforce those values and keep pushing those values. You have to agree the behaviors, and you have to reinforce the positive behaviors and discourage bad behaviors. So it goes into people's performance feedback. It's something that's mentioned in meetings. It's so on and so forth. You have a glossary, you have a language that you will agree. By the way, on our website, we have an essential glossary. You can download it. We can send it to you for free. But when you use a term, James, you use the term productivity. I'm not going to ask you to define it, but I bet everybody in this call has a slightly different definition of it. So make sure when you use a word, you know what you mean. There probably are words you want to stop using. So one of the words that we provocatively stop people using is savings, because we don't know what savings means. When more money is going into the health service each year, it's not about savings, it's about moving money around. It's allocation or investment and disinvestment. So you can see how little changes in there. And then it's this thing about the artifacts. So Ishaka, we can take you, it won't surprise you, we can do a whole seminar on those 4 aspects and take you through thinking about the actions that leaders can take. But leaders need to be trained in this, they need to be taught in this, they need to be supported, they need to be mentored in this, and so forth. So it's a deliberate action to support leaders to drive culture change. Then coming to the artifacts though, and the mandating. So here, this would be pretty cool. Or groovy is the word I often like to use, but cool I'll stick with. Wouldn't it be good if the Tynwald had a law that described the accounting for value reports for your major population groups? So every year, Tynwald publishes how well you're doing for the population at the end of life. Every year, Tynwald publishes how well you're doing for people on the island with diabetes. Every year, Tynwald publishes how well you're doing for people with frailty. Now, that would be really very powerful. Why would it be powerful? You're going to have to start collecting the data, because it would force you to start. If the law's there, you're going to have to do it. And when I say how well, I mean, I'm talking about outcomes here for the resources used. So that's what I mean by how well. And you're going to have to work out ways to actually deal with that. So you're going to have to start to organize to deliver that thing. So if there's one thing I'd mandate, it would be those annual reports. We call them accounting for value. And we've finished one now in Essex. We're just doing one now in Midlands. We are helping other places design them. So we've got a good idea of how you can create them and what they look like. You will need, as I understand, you will need to create new data. But if you're going to start creating data, create the right data. I think Muir was going to come in.
Yes, Tim, thank you. I think we're going to leave the last words with Muir, as we're almost up to our time. When you're having fun, time flies. But Muir, for the final thoughts.
Yeah, I think if you would identify, there's probably about 300 key people in the Isle of Man, 400. This is getting down to newly appointed GPs. These are the leaders of 2030 and 2040. And they include local newspapers, they include people in social care, people in housing, people in the finance departments, down to what we call Band 7. So it's probably about 300 or 400 people, quite large numbers. and they need to think in a different way. And we are quite Jesuitical in our approach, saying, well, we'd like, if it's of interest, to change the way those people think. It's not just the top of the office, it's the next generation who are going to be running healthcare in the Isle of Man in 2030 and 2040.
Muir, thank you. And as I promised, we were to have a hard finish at 9. We're almost up to that time, so it just leaves me to do the thanks again to both Muir and Tim. As we said, it's our inaugural meeting. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do this every couple of weeks with guest speakers to talk through issues that I think are really vital to the reform programme. So we'll be publishing the next in 2 weeks' time. Also to Sir Jonathan, who's joined us as well, and hopefully will be hosting these to set the scene for each one. And to participants, thanks for joining us. And if there's any feedback, thoughts about how we develop these, be very grateful for those. But at that point, again, with all those thanks, most grateful, Muir and Tim, again, for spending the time with us. But as it's 9 o'clock and everyone needs to go off to their next meetings or work, I'll draw this meeting to a close. And just to say finally that this has been recorded, so will be on the website in due course. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks again, chaps. Perfectly timed, I think.